Welcome to Concordia Theological Seminary and to our Lectionary podcast. We're now at the seventh Sunday after Pentecost. We're still in the Gospel of Mark, in the 6th chapter, beginning with the 14th verse. And today we have a story, as you well know, of the story of the death of John the Baptist. And it's kind of in the Gospel of Mark, it's a one-off. It's a little strange because in the Gospels, we're used to the person of Jesus being the main character. He's the subject of all the verbs. And yet in this story, we have a kind of an interlude, or we divert from the main story and we go and tell the story of John the Baptist. And it's an intriguing story and it's a mysterious one. To say that it's not about Jesus, though, of course, would not be true, because by telling us the story of the death of John the Baptist, I think what the evangelist is doing is giving us a preview of the death of Jesus himself. And in a way, I think also this story gives a preview of the death of the martyrs who would follow in the train of Jesus. So let's take a look at this story, and we see it begins, verse 14. Here we have King Herod as the subject, and the king, in some texts it will include Herod. The king had heard, oh here we go, King Herod had heard. Why? Because his name was well known. The name of Jesus was well known. Now what had King Herod heard? He had heard that Jesus' disciples had been going out and doing all sorts of miraculous things and signs and wonders throughout his land. So he was intrigued and no doubt a little bit concerned about what this movement, this Galilean movement, might mean for his country and also for his own kingship. Now this is not the same Herod that we saw at the birth of Jesus, but you can imagine an earthly king being somewhat concerned that another king might be arising in the land. So his name was well known. And now what was Herod thinking to himself? Well, some people said that he was John the Baptist, had been raised from the dead. And because John the Baptist had been raised from the dead, well, then these great deeds were being done in his name, or being done in him. Now, verse 15, this reminds us of the question of who do you say that I am, that is asked famously by Jesus in Matthew chapter 16. So some people think he was, that John the Baptist had arisen from the dead, and others said that Elijah, or one of the prophets, that's verse 15, others said that he was Elijah, or Jesus was one of the prophets, had arisen. But people were unsure. Now, having heard this, Herod was rightly confused, because he says, and he's quite a theologian when you think about it, having heard this, Herod said, him who I apekephalisa, he who I took the head off, he who I decapitated, John the Baptist, has been raised. Now, this story could be taken out of the headlines today when you think about Christians who are tragically, their heads are being taken off for the sake of Christ and in witness to Christ. Herod is confused, but theologically he is right on, because Jesus is the one who comes after Elijah, the one who prepares the way. Jesus is like John the Baptist, but he is greater. So Herod doesn't know what to think about this. Now, it's at this point that Mark takes us back further into the story, because what happened before that Herod is thinking about these things, thinking about the Jesus movement in relationship to John the Baptist. So now we have a little flashback, I guess we would say, in a movie. So Herod was the one who had sent out, so he's like a Jesus figure in a sense, I suppose, in that Herod also does his apostoling. he also sends out, and he had taken hold of John, and he had bound him in prison. Now, this is very similar to what we'll see with the death of, or the passion narrative of Jesus Christ, who himself is seized and placed into prison. Now, why did John the Baptist go to prison? And this is really very interesting, and it's on account of Herodias, the wife of Philip, who is his brother, the brother of John the Baptist. So I think this is instructive for us because, what is it that we're willing to die for? What is it that we're willing to be made martyrs for? And oftentimes we'll say for the sake of the gospel, the pure gospel. And yet when you look at John the Baptist, he is in jail not because he particularly preached that Christ was the Messiah, although he did do that, but now he is in jail for calling out the king on something that he ought not have done. He has taken the wife of his brother, and John the Baptist has called him out on that. And because of that, because he has married his brother's wife, that is why John the Baptist is in prison. And I think, a lot of times we talk about, as pastors, should we address social issues? Well, in this case, yes, which is to say, here the topic is marriage, and I think we do well to uphold God's teaching on this, because when we teach marriage correctly, so also do we proclaim Christ, the crucified one, who is also the bridegroom for the church. Other places, John actually calls himself the friend of the bridegroom, and he calls Christ the bridegroom. So here we see why John is in prison. Now, what was John's reaction, or Herod's, reaction to all of this? First, John had been saying that it is not existent, it is not permitted, it is not lawful, it is not good for you, Herod, to take the Gunaika to Adelphu. It's not right for you to take the wife of your brother. Of course, John the Baptist had no force of law behind him. He simply had his prophetic voice. And the one, as you could imagine, who would get very angry with this is the wife herself, Herodias Anachan, which had a grudge. And you can imagine this, a woman's scorn. She's angry that, you don't call the king out on this, and you don't call the king's wife out on this. This is impolite. So the Herodias had it she had it in for him, and she wanted to kill him. That's what her desire was. She wanted to put him away, but she couldn't. Now, what then was the reaction of Herod? Well, Herod was not. To me, he's not shown or depicted as being particularly evil. That's not the point. He's a selfish person, and he's also a somewhat weak person, but he does have an inkling towards that which is right. So in verse 20 it says, Herod feared. He feared John, which is, when we think also about our society's reaction to us as prophets, pastors, when we proclaim the truth, I think we should recognize that there's something about secular society, something about the world that still actually fears the Christian message, because they know in some sense, they have an inkling that it might actually be true. So Herod feared John. Why? Because even if he did not know or accept all of John's message, he still knew that he was a righteous man, dikaion. This is the word used to describe Jesus on the cross by the centurion in the Gospel of Luke. He's dikaion and he's holy. Don't touch the holy man. So what did Herod do? He guarded him. He sunatre him. And what's interesting is he heard him many times. So Herod actually liked to hear John the Baptist preach. I think this is not only looking back to the past, but I think it's also pointing towards the future. I think it might even be pointing towards, for instance, St. Paul, who is there preaching before the Roman authorities, and the Roman authorities, while they don't quite come over, there is something compelling about the gospel message. And I think that's, this is a great, lesson for all of us, is that recognize that the world, Satan fears our message, but this message is powerful, and people will hear it. Strangely enough, even Herod knows something is going on here. So he hears him gladly. When he does, he likes to hear it. But now the plot thickens, because there happened an ukairu. This is an opportune time. I really wonder whether the evangelist Mark is kind of playing off the Gospel of Luke. And in the Gospel of Luke, after Satan tempts Jesus for 40 days, it says he left until an opportune time. And this is the way evil is. Never feel too safe. Your enemies are indeed watching, and they're waiting for the time to pounce. So, when is the opportune time that Herodias can pounce on John the Baptist? Well, it's when Herod has a date known. He makes a banquet, and he invites all this, the great people there, the Chiliarchs, the leaders of the thousands, and the first among Galilee. So, as we know, the banquet is not simply about eating, but it is feasting. And no doubt, Herod and the group, they were in their cups. There would have been a lot of drinking going on. But there would also been a lot of posturing. This was the chance for Herod to show himself off as the great king and as the great leader. And he certainly didn't want to be embarrassed by anything that would take place. So what happened, of course, is then came the daughter, the Thugatras, the daughter of Herodias, his daughter, or her daughter, came in, and what did she do? She began to dance for him, and it was quite pleasing to Herod. And you can imagine, as he's drinking his wine, he's thinking, what a wonderful thing this is. So the daughter of Herodias comes in, she begins dancing, and it was pleasing to Herod and to all those who were dining with him. And the king makes this kind of grand statement, which I think you do after your third or fourth glass of wine, maybe more, who knows. But it's the kind of grandiose statement you can imagine somebody making when they're kind of full of themselves and they're really enjoying themselves. And I don't know whether the dance was lascivious or not, but it certainly could have been. Certainly the atmosphere was ripe for this sort of kind of grand pronouncement that Herod is going to make. So what does he say? He says to her, ask anything you want, up to a half. Ask for anything you want, and I will give it to you. In that sense, Herod does make himself as kind of it is a kind of false alternative to God in a sense, I suppose, because Herod himself becomes now the giver of all things. Now, so the daughter, she's in cahoots with the mother, and she went out to the mother and says, going out to his mother, and she says, "What shall I ask him for?" And then she says, the head of John the Baptist. Whew! Well, that's a pretty big price to pay. It does show you, though, when you think about what motivates people, anger motivates people, and revenge motivates people, and reputation does as well. And this, we say, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, ask whatever you will. Herodias cannot stand the fact that somebody is speaking against her name, calling her out on her sin, embarrassing her. So rather than be shamed, she would rather put to death the person who's speaking this. And this is also true, I think, of the Christian church. One of the reasons people hate us, we can be jerks and we can say the wrong thing, But if we speak the truth and we call people out on their sins, even as we call ourselves out on our sins, we will be hated. They don't want us on the stage, and they want our voices to be silent. And so, the head of John the Baptist is what she wants. And she says, and she comes in with spudes hastily towards the king, and she asks him, I want that you should give me the head of John the Baptist on the platter. The head of John the Baptist, serve it up to me upon a platter, and what a great gift this will be. Well, we see, the evil does not always come in the form of willful men, but often comes from weak men and women. That is to say, there are certain plotters and planners, people who really do want our demise. And then there are people also who simply are feckless, or people who are weak, people who in the end care more about their own reputation than they do about what is right. And you can see here this word, perilupus. Jesus is called, in Matthew, I think Matthew, Jesus calls himself, my soul is sorrowful, even unto death. But now the king, he becomes exceedingly sorrowful. He doesn't want to do this. And why is he sorrowful? On account of his oath. And, he made this grand promise. It's not like he's really a great man here, that he's keeping his word. But what he didn't want to do is he didn't want to displease the guests. It's interesting. It's his oath. I've got to be true to my oath, but also to the guests. And who are the guests? Well, these are the leading lights of society, the Kiliarchs and the first people, and the great feast. These are the people he doesn't want to become embarrassed. And this is, it's oftentimes evil is done by the pettiest and smallest of people, because apart from Christ, we try to build ourselves up, and when we do, we so easily become petty tyrants. And this is what King Herod has become. So what does the king do? He acts swiftly and immediately. Again, there's a kind of Christological, the king sends to his guard, or the ones who are serving him as his guard, and he commanded them, epataxin. This same word, by the way, does, this whole story, not only does it go back to what the disciples had done, the next story will be the feeding of the 5,000 in a very different kind of feast, a feast given by our Lord Jesus, in which he commands, or epitaxin, the people to lie or recline in rows in the desert, where he will give them the bread to eat. But this is a different kind of feast with a different kind of ruler. So he commands them to bring his head. And so verse 28, we see that, again, going out, he beheaded him in prison, he beheaded him in prison, and he brought his head upon a platter. So the story is repeated, that they did as he said. And it's a kind of a tragic picture. And there's a kind of a communion here. Is, Jesus gave the bread to the apostles, and the apostles gave that bread to the people. Now we see he gave it to, in verse 28, he says, brought the head on the platter. He gave it to the Korasah, the girl, and the girl then gave the head to her mother. So how pleased she was. The daughter had avenged the shame that her mother had gone through, because the prophet spoke the truth. And of course, as this ends, having heard this, his disciples, that's the disciples of John the Baptist, they came and they carried the body, or his corpse, and they laid it there in the tomb. And this could be a Good Friday story here This is the story that of what will happen to Jesus as he himself is put to death for speaking the truth and then is laid into the tomb. Is this the end of the story? Well, it begins with, it's going to go right into, imagine what Jesus is thinking about when he hears about this story. He knows he has work to do because he knows that the fate of John the Baptist will be his fate as well. He too must be prepared for the night on which he was betrayed. When he will give bread, when he will hold a feast, he too must prepare for his own death. And I think this is a lesson for all of us. If we are to be prophets in the name of Christ, we too must be prepared. We must be prepared to suffer, perhaps jail. Who knows, in our society now, it could be even this, something like this. It certainly is for Christians in Libya, the martyrs. So this is the Christian life, the cruciform life, to be laid into a tomb. Of course, we already know how it ends, though. We need not despair, because remember this word in verse 16, agerthe. The king had thought that John the Baptist had been raised from the dead, and indeed, John the Baptist will in fact be raised from the dead as Jesus has been, and that's our future hope, and that gives us the courage to be like John the Baptist and to speak the truth of Christ. Well, thank you for this time together and for being with us, and I do pray blessings upon your week and upon the sermons that you preach. Thanks.